This is the disturbing US war crime iceberg explained. Tier 1. Abu Ghraib Prisoner. It's 2003. The United States has invaded Iraq, claiming the country is hiding weapons of mass destruction and has ties to terrorist networks. Within weeks, Saddam Hussein's government collapses, and American forces suddenly find themselves occupying an entire country. Many Iraqis are not thrilled about that arrangement, so insurgent attacks begin spreading across the country. In response, U.S. forces conduct raids and mass arrests, detaining thousands of suspected insurgents. And once you detain that many people, you run into a basic logistical problem. You have to put them somewhere. That somewhere was Abu Ghraib, a massive prison west of Baghdad. Under Saddam, it had already gained international infamy for torture and executions. After the invasion, U.S. forces took control of the facility and filled it again, this time with Iraqis picked up during raids. Many of them were civilians with no proven ties to insurgent activity. The prison became overcrowded and understaffed almost immediately. The soldiers assigned to guard it were members of the 372nd Military Police Company, an Army Reserve unit from Maryland. They were trained as military police, not longtime prison operators, and they were suddenly responsible for managing thousands of detainees with little clear guidance. At the same time, military intelligence personnel and civilian interrogators were pressuring guards to soften up detainees before questioning. The goal was to make prisoners more psychologically vulnerable and cooperative during interrogations about insurgent activity or weapons. But no one clearly defined what softening up meant. That ambiguity left room for abuse. Between October and December 2003, abuse became routine. Prisoners were beaten, slammed into walls, and stomped on while hooded and restrained. Chemical light sticks were broken and poured onto their skin. Military dogs were brought in to intimidate detainees, sometimes lunging at them. Humiliation became another tool. Guards posed prisoners for nude photographs. Detainees were stripped naked, stacked into human pyramids, forced to simulate intimate acts, and made to crawl on leashes with women's underwear on their heads, all while the guards stood around laughing and taking photos. The most famous image from this prison is this: a hooded prisoner standing on a box with wires attached to his fingers. He was told he would be electrocuted if he fell. There was no electricity, but he had no way of knowing that. He believed one wrong movement could kill him. One of the most shocking things about Abu Ghraib was how openly the abuse was documented. Soldiers posed for photos with injured detainees with smiles on their faces. Some of them later said they believed they were just following orders. The abuse only became public in early 2004, after specialist Joseph Darby reported the photographs to investigators. When the photos became public, the U.S. military charged several soldiers who appeared directly in the images. In total, 11 soldiers were convicted. Their sentences ranged from dishonorable discharges to several years in military prison. Higher-ranking officers were removed or reprimanded, but no senior commanders faced criminal prosecution. The question that was never fully answered in court was how abuse became normalized inside a U.S.-run military prison for months, and why accountability largely stopped at the lowest ranks. Lai Massacre. It's 1968, and the United States has been fighting in Vietnam for years. The stated goal is to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, but the war is dragging on and morale is low. Soldiers are dying in booby traps and ambushes set by Viet Cong fighters. Guerrillas who blend in with the local population and are almost impossible to distinguish from civilians. That frustration has been building for months inside Charlie Company, a U.S. Army unit stationed in Quang Ngai Province, an area the military considers a Viet Cong stronghold. On March 16, 1968, Charlie Company helicopters land outside the village of My Lai. The soldiers have been told the village is sheltering fighters from the Viet Cong's 48th Battalion, and that most civilians will have already left for the market by the time they arrive. They step off the helicopters expecting a firefight. Instead, they find villagers going about their morning. Old men, women, and children cooking breakfast and starting their day. There are no visible weapons and no fighters in sight, but the soldiers do not slow down to sort out who is who. The platoon leader, Lieutenant William Calley, ordered his men to move through the village and round people up. They did exactly as instructed. Villagers were pulled from their homes and herded toward an irrigation ditch at the edge of town. Once the groups were gathered, Calley's men opened fire, killing everyone, including children and infants. And it did not stop there. The ditch was only one location. The violence spread throughout the village. Soldiers went from house to house, throwing grenades inside. When villagers ran into the open trying to escape, they were shot in the fields. In one instance, a man was thrown into a well and a grenade was dropped in after him. Livestock were killed. Homes were set on fire. and crops were destroyed as the unit moved forward. Some soldiers also pulled girls out from the groups being held, sexually assaulted them, and then killed them with gunfire or bayonets. The shooting slowed only when Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, who was flying a helicopter above the village, realized that American soldiers were killing civilians. After seeing bodies on the ground and people being chased, he brought his helicopter down and landed it between the soldiers and a group of surviving villagers. He told his door gunner to aim the machine gun at the U.S. troops and to fire if they kept shooting civilians. Once the soldiers stopped, Thompson and his crew helped move wounded villagers out of the area. The U.S. Army records later confirmed 182 women, 17 of them pregnant, and 173 children, including 56 infants, were killed. There were almost no military-age men found anywhere in the village, dead or alive. The killing continued long enough that it could have stopped at several points, but it didn't. After the operation ended, the army reported a successful fight with enemy forces. That report stayed in place until soldiers and journalists brought forward photos and testimony. In the end, only Kelly was convicted, but his sentence was reduced almost immediately. He served about 3.5 years under house arrest and was paroled in 1974. Nobody else went to prison for what happened at My Lai. Haditha killings. It's 2005, 2 years since the U.S. Army occupied Iraq. The war had turned into a grinding fight against an insurgency, and one of the most dangerous weapons the insurgents used were IEDs, homemade roadside bombs buried under roads and triggered remotely. U.S. troops were dying to bombs they couldn't see, planted by people they couldn't identify. That tension had been building for months in Haditha, a city in western Iraq where a Marine unit called Kilo Company had been stationed. On the morning of November 19, a U.S. Marine convoy was driving through a quiet neighborhood in Haditha. Suddenly, one of the vehicles hit a roadside bomb. The blast killed 20-year-old Lance Corporal Miguel Terrazas instantly. The Marines in his unit couldn't find the attacker, so they took a different approach. They turned their attention to whoever was nearby. A few minutes later, a civilian taxi happened to pass by. Staff Sergeant Frank Wooderich, the squad leader, ordered it to stop. Inside were 5 Iraqi men, a driver and 4 college students. None of them had weapons, but that didn't matter. The Marines pulled them out and shot them by the roadside. Instead of stopping there, Wooderich led his squad into the nearest houses. The first belonged to the Abdul Hamid Hassan Ali family. 7 civilians were killed, including a 76-year-old man in a wheelchair. A mother threw herself over her 3-year-old daughter to shield her. The mother died, but the toddler survived, drenched in her mother's blood. Next door was the house of Yunus Salim Kafif. Grenades and automatic fire tore through each room. In one bedroom, several girls and women were hiding. The squad threw a grenade first, then followed up with gunfire. 6 children, aged 14, 10, 8, 5, 3, and 1, were killed. Only one girl survived by playing dead. A third house down the street saw 4 more civilians shot and killed. By the end, 24 civilians were dead, ranging in age from 1 to 76. Not a single weapon was found in any of the homes. The next day, the Marine Corps filed a report claiming a roadside bomb had killed 15 civilians, and that Marines had killed 8 insurgents in a firefight. There was no mention of houses, grenades, or children. The military paid $38,000 in condolence payments to families of 15 of the dead, treating it as an accident. That version of events lasted 4 months until Time magazine reporter Tim McGurk obtained footage from a local human rights worker and tracked down survivor accounts. His March 2006 story included photos of bullet-riddled rooms and people shot at close range. The official story collapsed. A criminal investigation confirmed the civilians had been deliberately killed, and that multiple officers had accepted the original false report without question. 8 Marines were charged, but 6 had their cases dropped or were cleared. Wooderich, the squad leader, was the only one facing consequences. In January 2012, he pleaded guilty to 1 charge of careless failure, received a rank reduction, and walked out of court the same day. No Gun Ri Massacre. Imagine you're a farmer in a small Korean village. It's late July 1950, and the Korean War has just started. A month earlier, North Korea invaded South Korea out of nowhere, and the U.S. jumped in to help push them back. But the North Koreans are advancing fast, and the front line is getting closer to your home every day. Your neighbors are packing bags, people are whispering that the soldiers are coming, and nobody really knows what's going to happen next. Then one morning, U.S. soldiers come through your village and tell everyone to evacuate. You grab your kids, your grandmother, and whatever else you can carry, and you join hundreds of other villagers heading south on foot. When the group reaches a railroad bridge near a village called No Gun Ri, American soldiers stop everyone and tell them to wait there. The soldiers search the group for weapons and find nothing. Then, without a word, the soldiers leave. A few minutes later, out of nowhere, American planes appear in the sky and open fire on the crowd with machine guns. Some survivors later said bombs and rockets were dropped too. As the crowd screams and scatters, you and other survivors scramble into the 2 tunnels below the bridge, thinking the walls will protect you from the planes. But the attack isn't over just yet. After the airstrike, U.S. ground troops from the 7th Cavalry Regiment, already positioned at both ends of the bridge, began firing directly into the tunnels. For the next 3 days, from July 26 to July 29, they fired rifles and machine guns at whoever was inside, shooting at any and all movement. One veteran later recalled being told to fire on everything and to kill them all. By the time the shooting stopped on July 29, the ground inside the tunnels was littered with bodies. At least 163 people were confirmed dead or missing, though the real number was likely closer to 400. Most were women, children, and elderly villagers. What made it even worse was that the soldiers knew exactly who was under that bridge. Earlier that month, commanders had quietly ordered frontline troops to treat all refugees near the battle lines as potential enemies, based on rumors that North Korean soldiers might be disguising themselves as civilians. The classified documents later confirmed those orders, proving the 7th Cavalry was following them when the shooting began. The victims had been killed by the very military that was supposed to protect them. No one reported the killings. The U.S. military never filed a public record. The villagers buried the dead and stayed silent for decades. It wasn't until 1999, almost 50 years later, that journalists from the Associated Press interviewed survivors and veterans, uncovering secret memos that confirmed the orders. No soldiers were punished, no one was held responsible, and no apology was given. The U.S. Army later admitted civilians were killed, calling it a regrettable accident, though it's impossible to see how killing hundreds of people over 3 days could still be accidental. And just like that, the file was closed. Mahmudiyah. Imagine, you're a 14-year-old girl living in a small village in Iraq. Your house sits right next to a U.S. military checkpoint. You can see the soldiers from your garden, and they can see you. At first it seems fine. They're just doing their job. But then you start to notice they're watching you every day, in a way that's kind of creepy. And one day, one of them just walks up to you, runs his finger down your cheek, and starts flirting with you. Your family's so scared that your mom starts making plans to send you to stay with relatives further away. But before that can happen, her nightmare becomes a reality. On March 12, 2006, 5 U.S. Army soldiers from the 502nd Infantry Regiment were manning a traffic checkpoint on the edge of the village of Yusufia in Iraq. They were Stephen Green, James Barker, Paul Cortez, Jesse Spielman, and Brian Howard. The girl they had been watching was 14-year-old Abir Qasim al-Janabi, and her family's home was about 200 meters from their post. That day, the soldiers had been drinking alcohol and playing cards. After a while, the conversation took a dark turn. One of the soldiers, Stephen Green, suddenly brought up Abir. He already said out loud in the days before that he wanted to assault her, and he had been observing her for weeks. Now, drunk and worked up, he decided it was time to strike. Once he managed to convince the others, they made a plan. One soldier, Brian Howard, stayed back at the checkpoint to monitor the radio. The other 4, Green, Barker, Cortez, and Spielman, changed out of their military uniforms into dark civilian clothes so they wouldn't be recognized as U.S. soldiers. They grabbed their rifles and took a captured AK-47 to use later as a prop for a cover story. Then, they walked to the house in broad daylight. When they got inside, they split the family up immediately. Barker and Cortez grabbed Abir and dragged her into a bedroom, while Green and Spielman forced her parents and her 6-year-old sister Hadil into a separate room. Her mother understood immediately what was about to happen and tried to resist, but Green knocked her down, broke both of her arms, and then shot her, along with Abir's father and 6-year-old sister at close range. In the other room, Barker and Cortez assaulted Abir as the sound of gunshots carried through the house. When the shooting stopped, Green came in, told the others he had finished eliminating the family, and assaulted Abir as well. When it was over, he shot her in the head. To cover their tracks, the soldiers poured kerosene over Abir's half-naked body and set her on fire. They picked up their shell casings, burned their blood-soaked clothes, and placed an AK-47 next to the bodies so it would look like insurgents were behind the attack. Then, they just walked back to their checkpoint like nothing happened. Neighbors noticed the smoke and found the bodies. Iraqi army soldiers who arrived on the scene were told by the US soldiers that insurgents were responsible, and US commanders accepted that story and closed the case without further investigation. It probably would have stayed buried if not for what happened a few months later. In June 2006, 2 soldiers from the same regiment were captured and killed by insurgents. And during the psychological stress counseling that followed, one of the guilty soldiers, James Barker, accidentally shared some info about the March attack. Another soldier in the unit, Justin Watt, heard the rumors, put the pieces together, and made the decision to report everything up the chain of command. That single report forced the military to reopen the case. Once investigators dug in, they discovered the truth. Barker and Cortez both pleaded guilty to avoid getting the death sentence. Barker was sentenced to 90 years in prison and Cortez to 100 years. Spielman was convicted at court-martial and sentenced to 110 years in prison. Howard, who had remained at the checkpoint and said nothing afterward, ended up serving just 27 months on lesser charges. Green, the 4th participant, was a different case. He had already been discharged from the army for an undiagnosed personality disorder before the crime came to light, so he faced a civilian federal trial instead of a military one. A jury found him guilty of assault and multiple murders, gave him life in prison with no chance of parole ever, and he ended up taking his own life in prison in 2014. Kandahar Massacre. It's 2012, and the United States has been at war in Afghanistan for more than a decade. The invasion began in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. The US wanted to destroy Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban government that was sheltering them. But a decade later, the fighting still hasn't really stopped, and American soldiers keep getting deployed with no clear end in sight. One of those soldiers is Staff Sergeant Robert Bales. By this point, he has already been deployed 4 times across Iraq and Afghanistan. He has survived 10 IED blasts, been injured twice, and is showing serious signs of stress. He has just been assigned to Camp Belambe, a small base in Kandahar province, only weeks before the tragedy unfolds. That night, Bales is drinking alcohol he isn't supposed to have. He's also taking steroids and snorting a sedative drug called Valium. Other soldiers later said he seemed angry and restless the whole night. Then at some point before dawn, he got up, grabbed his 9mm pistol and M4 rifle, and walked off the base completely on his own. The first place he went to was Al-Khazai, a small farming village about half a mile north of the base. He just walked straight into houses in the area and started shooting. In the first house, he shot an elderly couple, then turned the gun on their grandchildren. In another, he killed a man and set his body on fire. Neighbors thought it was a militant attack, but when they got a look at the shooter, they realized he was an American soldier. When Bales got back to the base at around 1:30 a.m., he woke up a fellow soldier and told him what he had done. The soldier didn't believe him and went back to sleep. So Bales grabbed more ammunition and left again. This time he headed to a village called Najiban, about 1.5 miles south of the base. In Najiban, Bales entered the home of Haji Muhammad Wazir, a farmer who happened to be away that night. Inside the house were his entire extended family. Bales forced them into one room and opened fire. 11 people were killed, including Wazir's wife, mother, and children as young as 2 years old. A few children survived by hiding under the bodies of the dead and staying completely still until the shooting stopped. Even then, most of them were injured. After leaving the Wazir family's home, Bales kept moving through the village. He went from house to house, shooting people as he went, including a 15-year-old girl. By the time it was over, 16 civilians were dead. 9 of them were children. When Bales returned to the base for the second time, Afghan security forces had already noticed him leaving earlier and had alerted U.S. commanders. The troops had been assembled for a head count. Bales walked up, admitted what he had done, and briefly described what happened. His weapons were taken and he was placed in custody. By sunrise, the villages were in chaos. Families loaded the bodies of their relatives into pickup trucks, drove them to the nearby NATO base, and laid them out at the gate. The Pentagon responded quickly. Within days, Bales was flown out of Afghanistan for his own safety. In 2013, he pleaded guilty to 16 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty. A military jury sentenced him to life in prison without parole, and he is now serving that sentence in a maximum security prison in the United States. Tier 2. Bagram prisoner deaths. Imagine you're a 22-year-old taxi driver in Afghanistan, just trying to provide for your wife and 2-year-old daughter. One day, you pick up the wrong passengers, drive past the wrong checkpoint, and suddenly you're dragged out of your car and handed to American soldiers who are convinced you're a terrorist. You don't speak their language, can't explain yourself, and no one is listening. This happened in late 2002, shortly after the US invaded Afghanistan to hunt Al-Qaeda. Suspected militants were being rounded up and sent to detention sites across the country. One of the biggest was Bagram Air Base, where 2 civilian prisoners died after days of brutal treatment, becoming one of the most shocking cases of detainee torture in US custody. One of the victims was Dilawar, the taxi driver. On December 5, he was driving 3 passengers through Khost province when a local militia stopped the car at a checkpoint. One of the men had a broken walkie-talkie, and there was a voltage regulator sitting in the trunk. That was enough for the militia to accuse all 4 of helping carry out a rocket attack on a nearby American base earlier that day. They handed the men over to US forces for a cash reward. The evidence was thin, but it didn't matter. Dilawar and the 3 passengers were transferred to the detention facility at Bagram and placed in the custody of US military police. From the start, he was treated as an enemy. He was shackled, hooded, and interrogated at night. His wrists were chained to the ceiling of his cell so he couldn't sit or lie down. Almost immediately, the beating started. Guards repeatedly kicked Dilawar in the legs using a move called the peroneal strike, which targets a nerve on the outside of the lower leg. It's supposed to cause short bursts of pain so a detainee complies during questioning. Instead, soldiers kept using it over and over again. According to later testimony from one of the military police, it eventually turned into a kind of sick pastime. Guards would hit him just to hear him cry out Allah in pain, and others started coming by the cell to try it themselves. Meanwhile, another prisoner at the same facility, a man named Habibullah, was being treated the same way. He died on December 4, 2002, under similar conditions. The beatings went on for more than 5 days. By the time Dilawar was brought in for his final interrogation, his legs were so damaged he couldn't move or bend them anymore. A few hours later, on December 10, 2002, a doctor came by and found him dead. The US military's first statement said Dilawar died of natural causes. His family was told his heart had simply failed, but the autopsy told a very different story. The military's own medical examiner concluded that Dilawar had died from blunt force trauma to the legs. His legs had been beaten so badly that if he had survived, doctors said both would likely need to be amputated. Once that came out, investigations finally began. Several guards were charged with abuse, but none were charged with murder. An army review later concluded the beatings did not directly cause his death, which is a strange conclusion given the condition of his legs. No commanding officer was held responsible, and the same kicking technique stayed in use afterward. Maywand District, Kill Team. It's 2010, and US troops have spent nearly a decade fighting in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The war drags on with no end in sight. At a small base called FOB Ramrod in Kandahar, one group of soldiers had stopped caring about the mission and were looking for something far darker. The platoon had been deployed since mid-2009, and by the end of that year, their squad leader, Staff Sergeant Calvin Gibbs, was openly talking about wanting to kill Afghan civilians just for the thrill. It would have been a sick joke if it were one, but he wasn't joking. He quietly collected extra grenades, stashed them, and started planning with the others. Their plan was to find a random, unarmed civilian, get close, throw a grenade, duck behind cover, shoot them while they were down, and then plant a weapon nearby to make it look like the man attacked first. They called these planted weapons drop weapons, and Gibbs made sure they always had a stash ready. Their first kill using this method happened on January 15, 2010. The platoon was passing through the village of La Muhammad Kalai when 2 soldiers, Morlock and Holmes, spotted a 15-year-old boy named Gulmuddin doing farm work outside his home. They waved him over, and when he got close enough, Morlock pulled out one of Gibbs' grenades, threw it at him, and ducked behind a wall as Holmes opened fire. Gulmuddin was armed and had no idea what was about to happen. After he was dead, Gibbs grabbed the boy's head and posed for a photo. On May 2, the platoon struck again in the village of Kaladai. Gibbs, Morlock, and another soldier dragged an elderly cleric to a ditch, made him kneel, and Gibbs threw a grenade. The others fired, and Gibbs finished him off with 2 shots to the head. His wife and kids watched, screaming, and had to be pulled away. Gibbs then took the man's finger as a trophy and handed a tooth to another soldier. Over the next few months, Gibbs and a few others killed more civilians, mutilated bodies, and posed for pictures. Specialist Adam Winfield, a member of the unit, tried to report the murders through his father, but nothing happened. The case only broke when in May 2010, a soldier reported drug use in his room to an officer and mentioned the killings. The next day, he was beaten by 7 soldiers, and that assault led investigators to uncover the photos, body parts, and confessions. In total, 5 soldiers were charged with murder: Gibbs, Morlock, Winfield, Andrew Holmes, and Michael Wagner. Morlock was the first to confess, pleading guilty to 3 killings and getting 24 years. Holmes admitted to the first killing and keeping a finger bone from the victim, and walked away with 7 years. Winfield, the one who had tried to warn the army from the start, got 3 years after cooperating with investigators. Gibbs, who ran the whole operation from the beginning, was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Wagner was the only murder suspect who walked free. The Army's own investigating officer had twice recommended dropping the charges against him before trial, and in February 2011, the senior commander at Lewis McChord agreed and dropped all charges. The official reason given was, in the interest of justice, with no further explanation provided. Phoenix Program Assassinations. Between 1968 and 1972, during the Vietnam War, the CIA and US military launched a secret campaign called the Phoenix Program. Their target was the shadow government of the Viet Cong, a secret network of spies and informants hiding in regular villages that organized the war from the inside. The CIA's goal was simple: find Viet Cong members and capture them alive for questioning. To do it, they set up interrogation centers across South Vietnam and hired special hit squads called Provincial Reconnaissance Units, or PRUs. These squads were mostly local fighters, often former enemies recruited for their knowledge of the terrain and people. The problem was, capturing anyone alive was hard. The whole program ran on quotas. Local teams had to neutralize a certain number of Viet Cong each month. Neutralized meant captured, convinced to defect, or killed. At its peak, commanders demanded up to 1,800 neutralizations per month nationwide. That created a predictable issue. If squads couldn't find real Viet Cong, they still had to hit their numbers. So names got added to lists just to fill quotas. Anyone could be labeled a Viet Cong, which made the system easy to abuse. Villagers used it to settle grudges. Officials used it to extort money. And the PRUs quickly realized it was easier to just shoot suspects on the spot. A dead body counted toward the quota just as well. By the time the program officially ended in 1972, the official US numbers said more than 80,000 people had been neutralized, with more than 26,000 of them killed. South Vietnamese government figures put the death toll closer to 41,000. How many of those people were actually Viet Cong organizers and how many were just innocent farmers is something that was never properly investigated. The program was shut down, the files were closed, nobody from the program was ever prosecuted, and the US moved on. Tiger Force. In the middle of the Vietnam War in 1967, deep in the Song Ve Valley of Vietnam, a small group of American soldiers were moving through the jungle. This was Tiger Force, an elite 45-man platoon from the 101st Airborne Division. Officially, their job was to scout ahead and locate the enemy for the main army. But the villagers quickly realized the truth. These men weren't looking for enemies. They were looking for victims. The valley wasn't exactly a hotbed of enemy activity. Army records from the time show the villagers there were mostly farmers. But Tiger Force's commander, Lieutenant James Hawkins, ordered his men to clear the valley and force the civilians out if necessary. What followed went far beyond that. Soldiers started shooting farmers in the rice paddies, tossing grenades into bunkers where women and children were hiding, and executing prisoners whose hands were already tied. One soldier even shot a 15-year-old boy simply to take his shoes. This spree continued for 7 months straight, from May through November. It only got worse. Soldiers began cutting off ears and scalps from the bodies as trophies, stringing them into necklaces to wear. One soldier even decapitated a baby to steal a necklace, a detail later confirmed through multiple witness statements. The atrocities Tiger Force committed are especially terrifying because their commanders knew exactly what was happening. The system above them encouraged it. In Vietnam, the US military measured success by body count. More bodies meant higher numbers, and higher numbers made the bosses look good. Colonel Gerald Morse, who oversaw Tiger Force, set an initial kill target of 327, matching the battalion's designation, the 327th Infantry. Every body, whether a Viet Cong fighter or a farmer, was counted as an enemy kill. By the end of the campaign, one Tiger Force soldier named Sam Ibarra had run the numbers up so high that the total had tripled past the original target. The official US military newspaper, Stars and Stripes, even ran a story celebrating him for recording the 1,000th kill of the operation. Eventually, the military started investigating this by accident. In 1971, Army criminal investigators were looking into a completely separate case. While at it, they found a sergeant named Gary Coy, who mentioned that a Tiger Force soldier had decapitated a baby back in the Central Highlands. That one detail was enough to open a full investigation. Over the next 4 years, they collected sworn statements from dozens of Tiger Force veterans, documented 30 separate violations of international law, and confirmed that many of the killings had actually happened. But even after they had all the confessions and evidence, they did nothing with it. In November 1975, the Pentagon closed the case without charging a single person. 5 soldiers and 1 officer were quietly allowed to resign with no criminal record, and the men of Tiger Force became one of the most decorated soldiers of the Vietnam War. Tier 3. Operation Speedy Express. Imagine you're a rice farmer in southern Vietnam in 1968. You're not a soldier and you don't own a gun. Then one day you hear a helicopter getting closer and closer. And before you can even run, the people inside start firing at you and everyone around you. That's what Operation Speedy Express looked like from the ground. The US military ran this operation for 6 months, from December 1968 to May 1969 in the Mekong Delta, a giant flat farming region in southern Vietnam full of rivers, rice fields, and about 6 million ordinary people. By this point, the US had already been fighting in Vietnam for years, and the war was not going the way anyone hoped. Peace talks were happening in Paris, but the military was under heavy pressure to prove the war was actually accomplishing something. The man put in charge of one major campaign was Major General Julian Ewell, and he had a very simple way of measuring success: body count. His reasoning was that holding territory in Vietnam did not work. Enemy fighters could disappear into the jungle and come back as soon as American troops left. So instead of measuring success by land captured, the military counted how many enemy bodies were left behind. Ewell pushed that logic as far as it could go. His officers were expected to produce high kill numbers every single day, and anyone who failed to deliver knew their career was on the line. That pressure went straight down to the soldiers on the ground, and those soldiers came up with a dark solution. If someone was dead and Vietnamese, just mark them down as Viet Cong. The army also marked huge sections of farmland as free fire zones, which meant soldiers could shoot anything that moved without asking anyone for permission. On top of that, helicopter pilots later admitted they sometimes fired at anyone wearing black pajamas, even though that was the everyday clothing of farmers across the Delta. The system made almost anyone in the area a potential target, whether they were a fighter or not. To carry out the operation, the US deployed about 8,000 ground troops, along with 50 artillery guns and 50 helicopters, all backed by constant airstrikes. For 6 months, that firepower was aimed at one of the most densely populated farming regions in the country. Helicopter gunships circled overhead, firing at anything that moved. Artillery shells pounded villagers, and bombers flattened entire areas from the sky. In June 1972, 3 years after the operation ended, journalists Kevin Buckley and Alex Shimkin started digging. Survivors told them that the Americans shot everything that moved, and as they pieced the accounts together, they realized that during the attacks, civilians were dying at a pace that matched a Lai Massacre every month. When they tried to publish their findings, Newsweek's editors, nervous about government backlash, pulled the story. By the end of the operation, the division claimed it had killed nearly 11,000 enemy soldiers. But there was a major problem. Only 748 weapons were recovered, which works out to about 14 dead enemies for every 1 gun found. In guerrilla warfare, that ratio makes very little sense. Weapons are valuable, and fighters usually try to recover the guns of their dead before retreating. So when thousands of bodies are counted, but very few weapons show up, it raises an obvious question about how many of those enemy fighters were actually civilians. A 1972 report by the Army's Inspector General later estimated that civilian deaths during the operation likely ranged between 5,000 and 7,000 people. The report was classified and kept secret for decades. War. Mutilation of Japanese dead. On May 22, 1944, a young woman sat at her desk, pen in hand, posing for a photo that would end up in Life magazine, one of the most widely read magazines in the US at the time. On the table in front of her was a polished human skull. According to the magazine's caption, a Navy lieutenant had mailed it to her from the Pacific as a gift. She gave it a nickname, Tojo, after the Japanese Prime Minister at the time. To understand how something like that ended up in a national magazine, you have to remember what was happening in the world at the time. World War II was raging across 2 fronts at the same time. In Europe, America was fighting Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, America was fighting Japan, and the two wars felt completely different. The fight in Europe was described as a battle against evil leaders, but the fight in the Pacific was known for being something more disturbing. For years, the US government ran propaganda that stopped drawing Japanese soldiers as people and started drawing them as rats, monkeys, and vermin. When you tell thousands of young men that they are actually fighting an infestation instead of an army of actual people, they start acting like exterminators. This removal of humanity gave the soldiers permission to do things that would have been illegal in any other war. Soldiers on Pacific battlefields began collecting Japanese body parts as trophies and sending them home. The most common were skulls and teeth. To get a clean skull, soldiers boiled the heads of dead enemies in large pots to melt the flesh off, then mailed the bones home as souvenirs or gifts. Some skulls ended up on soldiers' desks. Others got used as decorations around military camps. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who traveled through the Pacific during the war, wrote in his diary about seeing Japanese corpses with ears and noses cut off. When he passed through customs in Hawaii in 1944, he noted that customs officers were asking every single passenger whether they were carrying bones in their luggage, because so many soldiers were taking human remains home. It was also about money. Back then, it was very common for people to have gold fillings in their teeth. The soldiers realized that the enemy's mouth was basically a treasure chest, so they carried pliers to rip these gold teeth right out of the jaws. After that, they traded the gold to sailors for alcohol. This disturbing practice even reached the White House. A U.S. congressman actually sent President Roosevelt a letter opener carved from a Japanese soldier's arm bone as a gift. Roosevelt rejected it hard, calling it revolting, and ordered the bone to be buried properly instead. Decades later, the Japanese government sent teams to the Pacific Islands to recover their dead. They found a disturbing statistic. More than half of the bodies they found were missing their heads. Those families got everything back, except the part that told them it was really their son. Assault of Okinawa. In July 1945, on the island of Okinawa, the United States had just won the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War and taken control of the island. In the tiny village of Katsuyama, 3 American Marines would walk down the street looking completely relaxed. Yet the villagers were terrified. They knew the soldiers weren't there on patrol. They were there looking for women. Before the Americans arrived, Japanese forces had spent months telling Okinawan civilians that U.S. soldiers were monsters who would torture and murder anyone they captured. The fear ran so deep that thousands of families jumped off cliffs and killed themselves rather than risk being taken alive. So when American troops first arrived and treated civilians with basic decency, many Okinawans felt an enormous sense of relief. But that relief didn't last long. For thousands of women, the rumors people had been warned about started becoming a reality. Testimonies from villagers, personal diaries, newspaper reports, and later academic research all point to widespread assaults after the battle ended. Some estimates suggest as many as 10,000 women were attacked. Almost none of it was officially reported. Many victims were too afraid or ashamed to come forward, and those who did were often ignored by U.S. military police. In Katsuyama, villagers later said those same 3 Marines began returning every weekend. Each time they showed up, they forced the men in the village to bring the women out, then dragged them into the hills and assaulted them. Under occupation rules, there was nowhere to report it because only the U.S. military had the authority to prosecute its own soldiers. Eventually, the villagers decided to handle it themselves. According to those testimonies, one day in July 1945, when the 3 Marines came back unarmed and relaxed looking to do the usual deed, the villagers ambushed and killed them with the help of 2 armed Japanese soldiers still hiding in the nearby jungle. The bodies were carried up a mountain and sealed inside a cave. Everyone in the village swore to stay silent. The 3 Marines, all 19 years old, were listed as deserters and eventually declared missing in action. The village kept the secret for 52 years, until a man named Kijun Kishimoto, eaten by guilt, led searchers to the cave in 1997. The bones were identified through dental records and returned to the Marines' families in 2000. Nobody was charged. The U.S. military announced no plans to investigate, and Okinawan police confirmed the statute of limitations had expired decades earlier. Kishimoto, the man who helped authorities find the bodies, explained that the village stayed quiet because they were afraid that if Americans found out, there would be retaliation. The water cure. It's 1899. Just a year earlier, the United States fought Spain in the Spanish-American War, a short conflict where America pushed Spain out of most of its remaining colonies. When it ended, the U.S. took control of several of those territories, including the Philippines, which it bought from Spain for $20 million. The problem was the Filipino people had already been fighting Spain for their independence. They weren't about to accept a new foreign ruler just because the old one signed a check and walked away. So the war kept going, this time against the Americans. Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo knew his forces couldn't win a traditional battle against the US Army, so he changed tactics. His fighters stopped wearing uniforms, blended into villages, and launched surprise attacks before disappearing back into the population. American troops had expected a conventional war with two armies facing each other across a battlefield. Instead, they were stuck in a guerrilla conflict where they couldn't tell who was a rebel and who was just a farmer trying to get through the day. The military desperately wanted information about rebel hideouts, supply routes, and weapon caches, and they wanted it quickly. So they started using a technique called the water cure, which became a routine method for extracting information. The process was simple. Soldiers would pin a suspect to the ground and force a tube or funnel into their mouth. If the person resisted, they pried the jaw open with a rifle barrel. Teeth sometimes got smashed in the process, but no one really cared. Once the tube was in place, the soldiers started pouring in liquid. Sometimes it was just water. Other times they mixed it with salt or sand. They kept pouring until the person's stomach swelled so badly that, as one American soldier later described it, the victims looked swollen like toads. When the stomach was completely full, the soldiers would stomp or jump on the victim's belly with their full weight, forcing the water back out through the nose and mouth. Then they did it again and again. The cycle kept going until the prisoner gave them information or simply stopped breathing. Tier 4. Samar Pacification. Imagine you're an American soldier in the middle of the Philippine War. It's September 28, 1901, 3 years after your country occupied the islands. You're stationed in Balangiga, a small town on the jungle-covered island of Samar. Things are going fairly well. The locals are friendly. Your unit is holding its own. And for once, nothing seems out of the ordinary. Then, the church bells start ringing. Before anyone can react, hundreds of fighters hidden around town, disguised as laborers and locals, pull out machetes and swarm the plaza and barracks from every direction. Most of your friends are just hanging out, rifles stacked far away. By the time they reach their weapons, the attackers are already on top of them. When it's over, more than 48 American soldiers are dead, and the few survivors are fleeing to the coast on a boat. Back in Washington, the military is humiliated and furious. President Theodore Roosevelt wants the entire island of Samar to pay for what happened. So they sent in General Jacob H. Smith, a 61-year-old veteran, to crush the resistance. Smith had one approach. If you cannot find the fighters, destroy everything that keeps them alive. He cut off all food and trade coming into the island to starve the guerrillas out, then sent soldiers marching through the interior, burning villages, crops, and livestock. But that's not all. Smith went further than scorched earth. He pulled aside Major Littleton Waller, the Marine commander leading the ground operations, and told him he wanted no prisoners. He gave Waller a direct order to kill and burn. When Waller asked for clarification on who to shoot, Smith ordered that anyone capable of bearing arms. By his definition, anyone over the age of 10 could be executed. He essentially gave the US Army permission to kill children. And the rest, they say, is history. Historians estimate the total death toll from the campaign ranges from around 2,000 to 2,500, with some Filipino historians putting the number as high as 5,000. The majority of those who died didn't fall in battle. They starved because their food and homes were gone. Both Smith and Waller were eventually court-martialed, but neither faced murder or war crime charges. Smith was convicted of minor misconduct and received a formal scolding. Public pressure pushed for his retirement, yet he kept his pension and spent the rest of his life in Ohio. Waller walked away unpunished, while the press dubbed Smith the monster, even as the US military retired him quietly. Philippine concentration camps. While General Smith was burning down Samar in December 1901, another American commander was doing something just as dark a few islands away. At this point of the Philippine-American War, the US had already captured the main Filipino leader, Emilio Aguinaldo. But a general named Miguel Malvar was still fighting with his own army in the southern provinces of Batangas and Laguna. His soldiers were hard to catch because they used guerrilla tactics. They would attack American troops, then just walk back into the nearest village and blend in with the farmers and the families. The Americans couldn't tell who was a fighter and who was just a rice farmer. So, on December 8, Brigadier General J. Franklin Bell came up with a solution. He ordered every single man, woman, and child in Batangas and Laguna to pack whatever they could and move into small guarded zones inside the towns. They had 20 days to leave their homes. If anyone was found outside these lines after the deadline, they would be shot on sight. The reasoning was simple. Lock up the civilians and the enemy has nowhere to hide. The problem was the camps weren't built for so many people. Tens of thousands of families poured in with nowhere to sleep, ending up on the streets or in animal sheds. Toilets were scarce, human waste piled up everywhere, and the so-called zones of protection quickly became breeding grounds for cholera, smallpox, and other deadly diseases. To make matters worse, Bell ordered his troops to destroy everything outside the camps so Malvar's fighters would have nothing to eat. Villages were burned, farm animals slaughtered, and rice supplies torched. The plan was to starve the enemy, but it also starved the civilians trapped inside. According to historian Andrea Pitzer, over 11,000 people died in Bell's camps. Despite the staggering death toll, Bell defended his strategy, arguing that a short, brutal war was better than a long one. It worked. Malvar surrendered on April 16, 1902, but thousands of civilians had paid the price. Canicattì Massacre. It's the summer of 1943, and World War II is at a turning point. The Allies, led by the US and Britain, have just launched an invasion of Sicily and southern Italy to push the Nazis out of Europe entirely. Town by town, American troops are moving in, accepting surrenders and taking over as the new authority. On July 14, 1943, they were in a town called Canicattì. The Germans had already pulled out and the town had surrendered. The shooting was supposed to be over, but the civilians had a new problem. They were starving. The war had wiped out the shops and supply lines. So when word spread that a bombed-out factory still had food and liquid soap inside, a large crowd broke in and started filling up whatever containers they could find. A lieutenant colonel named George Herbert McCaffrey, who was serving as the top American civil affairs officer for the province, drove over to handle the situation personally. When he arrived, he ordered the crowd to leave, but they didn't, and somehow, he decided that was enough to justify the use of deadly force. He ordered the military police with him to open fire on the crowd, but the soldiers refused. They looked at the unarmed women and children holding buckets, looked back at their commander, and kept their fingers off the triggers. According to witness accounts, not a single MP fired. Instead of backing down, McCaffrey decided to take actions on his own. He drew his .45 caliber pistol and fired into the crowd. When the first magazine ran out, he reloaded and kept shooting, then reloaded again. He fired over 20 rounds in total. When it was over, at least 8 civilians were dead, including the local mayor and an 11-year-old girl. The U.S. Army investigated and decided there wasn't enough evidence to charge McCaffrey with murder. The ruling was that he had been trying to restore order. He faced no court-martial and no disciplinary action. McCaffrey continued serving and died on November 10, 1944, from tuberculosis while being treated in England. Tier 5. Moro Crater. It's 1906, and the United States has been running the Philippines as a colony for 8 years. Most of the fighting against Filipino independence fighters had died down, but in the southern islands, a group called the Moro people were still refusing to accept American rule. They wouldn't pay American taxes and wouldn't give up their weapons. The American governor in charge of the region, Major General Leonard Wood, had been trying to force them to comply for years without success. Eventually, after they got tired of being pushed around, a large group of Moro families, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people, packed up and moved to the top of a dormant volcano called Badajo on the island of Jolo. They saw the crater as a sacred place, and the steep jungle slopes made it easy to defend. While living up there, some of them began raiding nearby villages for food and cattle. Wood used this as justification to act. He sent word up the mountain asking the Moros to disarm and come down. When they refused, he asked them to at least send their women and children to safety. They refused that too. Convinced he'd done his best, on March 5, 1906, Wood ordered an attack. He sent Colonel Joseph W. Duncan with around 750 soldiers, all carrying heavy artillery. The slopes were thick and had thick vegetation, so it took 2 full days just to haul everything up. When they finally reached the peak and looked down into the crater, the soldiers could see Moro families still living in their bamboo huts. Then, without warning, they opened fire with everything they had. The Moros tried to fight back with swords and other close-range weapons, but they were cut down before they could even get close. Meanwhile, a naval gunboat stationed offshore was also sending fire into the crater, so there really was nowhere to run and no way to fight back. When the shooting finally stopped on March 8th, the Americans had lost 21 soldiers, and around 75 were wounded. On the other hand, of the roughly 800 to 1,000 Moro people in the crater, only 6 survived. Back in Washington, President Roosevelt sent a telegram congratulating General Wood on his brilliant feat of arms. The public wasn't impressed. A writer called Mark Twain fired off a furious essay, condemning the operation as hundreds of helpless people being trapped and shot from a safe position above. He sarcastically called it the greatest victory ever achieved by the Christian soldiers of the United States. The backlash removed Wood from his post as governor of Moro Province, but the military kept advancing him. In 1910, he became Army Chief of Staff, and in 1921, he was appointed Governor General of the Philippines, the same country where he had ordered the massacre. Children in bunker killings. Imagine you're a teenager living in rural Vietnam in 1969. The war has been raging your entire life, but this morning feels almost normal. You're walking through the woods near your village with a few friends, following the same path you've taken hundreds of times. Then, something catches your eye. A few meters ahead, armed soldiers are hidden in the bushes, watching your group. Before you even have a chance to react, they rush forward, grab you, and drag you away. It's March 1, 1969, and the Vietnam War is at one of its bloodiest points. American forces are scattered across the country in small patrols and ambush teams, trying to intercept enemy fighters moving through the jungle. That morning, an 8-man squad of U.S. Marines is lying in wait, invisible along the trail, ready to open fire on anyone who passes. Then, 3 Vietnamese girls, aged roughly 13, 17, and 19, and an 11-year-old boy stumble into the ambush and shout in surprise, blowing the Marines' cover. The squad leaders, Corporal Ronald Reese and Lance Corporal Stephen Critter, now have a decision to make. They could pack up and move to a new position, or detain the children safely until the mission ended. Under the laws of war, those were the only real options. But Reese and Critter decided to handle things their own way. They grabbed all 4 children, tied them with rope, gagged them, and dragged them to a small earthen bunker the locals used for shelter. Then, they shoved the kids inside, pulled the pin on a frag grenade, and threw it in. The explosion killed all 4 and collapsed the roof on top of them. Other members of the squad reported what happened, and the military charged both Reese and Critter with murder. A court-martial convicted them on 4 counts of murder each, and sentenced both men to life imprisonment with hard labor. But then the appeals process started. The authorities reviewing the case decided a life sentence was too harsh, and cut both punishments down to just 3 years of confinement. The U.S. military justice system looked at 4 bound and gagged children killed with a grenade and decided each life was worth about 3 years behind bars. And that's it for today's Iceberg. For every massacre that gets discovered, there are probably 10 others that stay buried in a classified file forever. History is always written by the winners, and usually, the winners are the ones with the best paper shredders. Like and subscribe if you like this video, and see you in the next Iceberg.